Welcome everybody. We're on the second study tonight in our series of the resurrection of the dead. And last time I thought I'd get all the Old Testament in one go. And if you were here and watched the video, you knew I was far too hopeful. So now we're not doing it all in one do. This is part two. And we've got 4 passages to look at. And we're looking at the prophets. So we're going to start, and I'm going to try and do them in date order. I like going through the Bible in date order, and it might surprise you who was one of the earliest prophets. I would like you to turn, please, to Jonah chapter 2. And we're going to look at Jonah. He was not a prophet to Israel, and at the same time, but he was one of the earliest prophets. And if you remember, he went off, God told him to go to Nineveh, and he said, I think I'll go in the other direction. And we all know the story. It's a Sunday school story. God turned him around by getting him thrown off board ship and swallowed up by a great fish. But there is actually a reference in that story that probably doesn't get into most Sunday school stories about resurrection. So I'd like us to start by somebody volunteering to read the first 6 verses of Jonah chapter 2. If you stick your hand up, I'll unmute you if that's easier, or you can unmute yourself if that's fine. Tracy will do it. Right, Tracy, the first 6 verses, please.
Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and all your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. Yet I shall look again upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought me up my life from the pit, O Lord my God.
Thank you, Tracy. Okay. The first question I've got for you, you don't have to answer it, but think about it. Where was Jonah when he prayed? Most people think he was in the belly of the fish. But what does it actually say sorry about that noise. What does it actually say in the text? It says, I cried out to the Lord because of my affliction, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol, I cried, and you heard my voice. As I mentioned last time, Sheol is the Hebrew word for grave. Jonah says he cried out to God from the grave. Then we go from there to the next verse, to the next part of what Tracy's just read for us. And Jonah describes what had happened to him. He'd been cast into the deep, into the seas. The waves came over him. He'd been cast out of your sight. And yet here he says, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. And then he says, the waters surrounded me, even to my soul or my life. The deeps closed around me, weeds were wrapped around my head. I went down to the moorings of the mountains, the earth with its bars closed behind me forever. Yet you have brought me up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. So do you get the picture here? Earlier he says, I've been cast out of your sight. but I will look again towards your holy temple. And then he says, I went right down, but you have brought me up from the pit. That word pit is the word we were looking at last time, which is the Hebrew word. And I must admit that last time I said, I'm beginning to wonder if this is what refers to hell, but having found it here in this passage, no, I think it's another Hebrew word for the grave. Because Jonah did not go to hell, he simply went into Sheol, the grave. And so let's just think about that for a minute and read the next bit, which, if somebody could please read from verse 7 to verse 2 of chapter 3. Who would like to do that? Don't all rush at once. Peter got there slightly first.
Right.
Okay, Peter, you're unmuted.
When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. But I, with a song of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. Salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you.
Thank you. Jonah carries on describing his experience, and his soul fainted within him. He remembered the Lord, and he called on the Lord in his holy temple. He says it's only the fool who forsakes their own mercy from God. And there's a form of repentance here, because he says, I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. I will pay what I vowed. Salvation is of the Lord. So where are we on this? We've seen a journey Jonah's been on. Jonah is somewhere, right? He's been running away from God, and he's turned his heart back to God. And he's recognized the safest place for salvation is with the Lord. And as Peter read, when he'd come to this, the fish was commanded to vomit Jonah out onto the beach. And then God said to him, and in my translation it says, arise, go to Nineveh. So you can unmute yourself, because I want an answer to this. We're looking at resurrection. Last time I said the resurrection we're looking at is not the resurrection of people like Lazarus and all the people Jesus raised and the people we hear from being raised from the dead in the Old Testament and in the New, who died again. But Jonah isn't alive today. Jonah did die again. So why am I looking at this passage in this book to talk about resurrection? Any clues? Or are you baffled?
Baffled.
Baffled. Thank you, Lucia. Anybody with clues?
Randall, is it something to do with Jesus using it as the sign that he gave to the Pharisees?
You're right on there, Nick. Exactly right. It's a lot to do with the fact that this is something that Jesus used. So in that case, Nick, can I ask you to read Matthew 12, verses 38 to 41? Matthew 12,
Yeah.
38 to 41.
Then some of the scribes and the Pharisees said to him, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." But he answered them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth."
A bit more, is there?
Sorry, did you say 41?
Yes. Is that 41? Should I have said 42?
No, I've read up to 40.
Right, 41 then, please.
"The men of Nineveh will arise at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And behold, something greater than Jonah is here."
Thank you. So, you all know this passage, right? But when Jesus said to them, "No sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah," he then spelt it out. He says, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." There's a very important word in what I've just read there that I suspect most of us do not connect with. It's a small one. Philip, if you want to say something, you'll have to unmute or I'll unmute you. I'll unmute you.
Heart.
Is that pan?
Heart.
Heart? No.
Heart of the earth.
Well, yes. It's in the heart of the earth, right? In the first bit, where did Jonah cry from? He didn't cry from the belly of the fish, but the belly of Sheol, right? But there is also another word there, which isn't the one you picked up on, Philip, but that is true, right? It's the second word when Jesus said, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights." Jesus, you need to weigh this, you need to ask God about it. Is that as got a stress on it? Just like Jonah was, so I will be, the Son of Man will be. Now, the Sunday school version of Jonah is he was lying around in the belly of the fish, getting washed over, and how on earth he breathes, I do not have an idea, because all these stomach fluids or whatever going around him, and but Jonah's testimony that he wrote afterwards, it was from the belly of Sheol, the belly of the grave. So is Jesus saying here to the Pharisees, when he was in the fish, he wasn't in the belly of the fish, he was in the heart of the earth, he was in the grave, in Sheol, and that's where I will be. And we do know that Jesus was spent much of the time he was in the grave, actually in the grave. Peter tells us in a most difficult passage for a lot of people that he went and preached to the saints in prison. He didn't descend into hell, but he descended in Greek into Hades, the Hebrew equivalent being Sheol. So, am I reading too much into it? Well, I want us to turn to another New Testament passage. I'd like somebody to read, please, Luke 24 and verses 44 to 48. Lucille, you were going to read earlier. Would you like to come in?
Luke 24.
Luke 24, 44 to 48.
44 to 48. Now he said to them, "These are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things which are written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures, and he said to them, "Thus it is written, that the Christ should suffer and rise again from the dead the third day, and that repentance for forgiveness of sins should be proclaimed in his name to all the nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things."
Thank you. Okay. Now, Jesus said to his disciples after he was raised, "Thus it is written, and thus it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead on the third day." That's the bit I want us to think about. Jesus says it is written that the Christ should suffer and rise from the dead on the third day. If I could ask somebody to read the first 5 verses of 1 Corinthians 15, 1 to 5. 1 Corinthians 15, 1 to 5. I'm looking for a volunteer. Reese will. You're unmuted, Reese. Fine.
First 5 verses, you said?
Yeah.
Moreover, brethren, I declare unto you the gospel which I preached unto you, which also ye have received and wherein ye stand, by which also ye are saved, if you keep in memory what I preached unto you, unless ye have believed in vain. For I delivered unto you first of all that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the scriptures, and that he was seen of Cephas, then of the 12.
Thank you. So Jesus told us that in the scriptures it was written that he would be in the grave 3 days and 3 nights. He would rise on the third day. Paul believed that. Here in 1 Corinthians, it's a chapter we will have to come back to when we get into the New Testament. He says it is written that he rose again it says he rose again on the third day according to the scriptures. Right. Where in the scriptures in the Old Testament does it tell us that the Christ would rise again on the third day? Anybody want to unmute and tell me where it says it? Have you ever thought about the question, or have you just accepted that Paul and Jesus were right? Well, folks, I have to say the only place I can find is in Jonah. That is the only place where it talks about being there for 3 days and 3 nights, or for 3 days, right? And I honestly cannot find anywhere else. And that made me begin to read Jonah's prayer in a different way, right? He was in the belly of the grave. and he cried out to the Lord, and he heard his voice. Jesus was in the grave, right? Jonah described being cast into the sea, and I have been cast out of your sight, yet I will look again towards your holy temple. Is that actually an echo of the words of Jesus? Could Jesus have said that? I have been cast out of your sight. When he became sin for us, his fellowship with God was broken. And yet, look at Psalm 22, which we've mentioned in previous studies. There's this great turning point. When he begins from going down, the psalmist from going down and getting darker, suddenly looks up and says, it's going to be all right. Yeah. Could it be the words of Jesus who says, the earth with its bars closed behind me forever? Yet you have brought up my life from the pit. Just one other thing here to say. Well, look, the next verse 7 onwards, again, could be the words of Jesus. When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord. My prayer went up to you into your holy temple. Those who regard worthless idols forsake their own mercy, but I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. I will pay what I have vowed, salvation to the Lord. Jesus had committed himself before the foundation of the world to becoming the sacrifice that his Father wanted. He paid his vow. He was salvation. He brought salvation, made it possible for the Lord to bring us into salvation. And if you remember, I asked us to read into the next chapter. And again, you need to think about this. I must admit, it had stood out to me, but then I found somebody else who says it as well. But you need to test it, because in most translations, I don't think Peter's did. It says this: now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, arise, go to Nineveh. And I'm not the only person to think that, but I have to say, is that really telling us? Because it was God who raised Jesus from the dead. You need to pray through these things. But I found in looking at it a lot more understanding here that this to me is the only occasion when we get something in the Old Testament about anybody being in the grave for 3 days and coming out on the third day. So we're going to look at one more passage, and then we're going to stop for a conversation for a little while. So at that point, you can come back to me on that and share with me what you're thinking and share with everybody else. But for now, please turn to Hosea chapter 13. And while you're getting there, I'll just tell you the outline. You may know the story of Hosea. One person has put chapters 1 to 3 are all about the prodigal people, a wife who is not faithful to Hosea. She goes off after her other men. She returns to prostitution. Chapters 4 to 10 are about a prodigal people, Israel, that keep going away from God. But chapters 11 to 14 are a message of restoration, that God will restore his people. And so we could read the whole of the chapter, but for time, I just want to read from verse 9 onwards a little bit. And the first section is verses 9 to 13. Do I have a volunteer to read those 4? Magdalene, you're unmuted.
O Israel, you are destroyed, but your help is from me. I will be your king. Where is any other, that he may save you in all your cities? And your judges, to whom you said, give me a king and princes. I gave you a king in my anger, and took him away in my wrath. The iniquity of Ephraim is bound up, his sin is stored up. The sorrows of a woman in childbirth shall come upon him. He is an unwise son, for he should not stay long where children are born.
A bit more, please.
I will ransom them from the power of the grave. I will redeem them from death. O death, I will be your plague. O grave, I will be your destruction. Pity is hidden from my eyes.
Thank you. So God is telling Israel that it is in a right mess, but he says to them, your help is from me. I will be your king. I will save you in all your cities. And your judges, to whom you said, give me a king and princes. I gave you a king in my anger and took him away in my wrath. Remember that when Israel asked for a king, Samuel thought they'd rejected him. And God said, no, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. And he gave them Saul. But Saul really was the people's choice as well. And Saul was not given to them to bless them. He was given to them in anger, and he was taken away in anger. But then God goes on to say that Ephraim, which is another name for Israel, is bound up. His sin is stored up. And then he gives this picture, which we're familiar with. It's about a woman in childbirth, labor pains, right? The sorrows of a woman in childbirth will come upon him. He is an unwise son, for he should not stay long where children are born. I'm not too sure about what that actually means, but I'm looking at the next two bits, which begin to make sense to us. I will ransom them from the power of the grave. Who? Ephraim, Israel. I will redeem them from death. O death, I will be your plagues. O grave, I will be your destruction. Pity is hidden from my eyes. These are familiar verses. In a minute, we're going to look at them. We're going to look at them in the New Testament, but I'm sure they're ringing bells with you. O death, I will be your plagues. O grave, I will be your destruction. But could somebody read the next two verses, please? Verses 15 and 16.
I'll do that.
Thank you.
Though he is fruitful among his brethren, an east wind shall come. The wind of the Lord shall come up from the wilderness. Then his spring shall become dry, and his fountain shall be dried up. He shall plunder the treasury of every desirable prize. Samaria is held guilty, for she has rebelled against her God. They shall fall by the sword. Their infants shall be dashed in pieces, and their women with child ripped open.
You know me, I'm great at making sure you read things in context. Those extra two verses don't actually say a lot about our subject, but it's good to read past just the verse you want. And he says that Israel, Ephraim will be fruitful amongst his brethren. Because of this wind, he shall spring up. Then his spring, well, he shall become dry, and so on. and Samaria is another part. So in the midst of this passage on judgment, he's talking about raising people up. Now, if you can go back to 1 Corinthians 15, but later on in the chapter, verses 53 to 57, and if somebody could read those, you'll hear an echo of the verses we've been reading. Who'd like to read them? Philip, I'll unmute you, Philip. Right, away you go.
For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. So when this corruptible has put on incorruption, and this mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is thy sting? O Hades, where is your victory? The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Next
Thank
bit.
you, Philip. Thank you, Philip.
That's probably from the Septuagint, by the way.
Almost certainly. Right. You recognize that, don't you? O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is law. And that reminds us of what Hosea got told to say. I will ransom you from the power of the grave. I will redeem them from death. O death, O death, I will be your plague. O grave, I will be your destruction. There's a parallel here. And so what I'm trying to say here is Hosea gives us some of the New Testament teaching that we are going to be raised from death. And so in Hosea, he's embedded this message of resurrection that the Sadducees couldn't see. But Jesus knew they didn't know the scriptures. And that's why he had a go at them. Right, we're going to pause there. I'm willing to take questions for a few minutes and so on. Who would like to come in? I'll either unmute you or you can unmute yourselves. Who's got a question? Who wants to put a counter thought or want to back something up? I'm here 5-10 minutes and then we'll move on to the rest of what we're going to look at this evening. Wendy, let me unmute you. You're unmuted. You can speak.
Yeah. I've got a naive comment that you said that Jonah prayed. It wasn't in the belly of the fish, but it says quite distinctly at the beginning he was in the fish, and at the end of the prayer he was then spat out.
Yes.
So I don't understand, please, why you can say he wasn't actually praying in the fish. I know it's something's happened in the future, he's saying, but
right. Well, to understand that, there are two graves in Scripture. There is the grave where our body goes, but there's this place called Sheol in Hebrew, where our spirit goes when we die. We know that from the New Testament. We will be looking at this more in the future, but for now, Jesus' body was in the grave. It was in a cave or something that had been pre-prepared as a burial chamber, and his body remained there for 3 days and 3 nights. But his spirit didn't. Peter, in 1 Peter 3, he can only have known it because I suspect at some point after he met the raised Jesus, he went up to him and said, Lord, what were you doing for those 3 days and night you're in the grave? What were you about? And Peter quite firmly says this very strange thing, and I don't think any of us really understand what he's on about. He says that it's round about 1 Peter 3 verse 20, he says, he descended and preached the gospel to those who were killed during the flood. And the King James Version puts hell, but the actual word is Hades, the Greek word for the grave. So with Jesus, his body remained in the tomb, but his spirit didn't remain in the tomb. He was busy going and reaching out to people. And I think the parallel is here. The body of Jonah would have been all the time in the stomach in the fish. But his spirit, Jonah says, was in Sheol. That's his words. It's not what I'm reading in, that's what the translation says. His spirit was in this world of the dead, for want of a better place. We do need to look at the question of where the dead are, and I'll be doing that separately, so I don't want to get too much here. I just want to say that the grave we are in, which we get raised from, there are two parts to it. There's the physical grave, which has our physical body in it, but there is the world of the dead, the place called Sheol or Hades, where our spirit goes.
What about Solomon, who said that the spirit goes back to God, the body goes to the earth, the dust goes to the earth, the spirit goes back to the God that gave it.
To its maker. Yeah, we'll have to look at in more detail. It's how we read into that is the question, right?
How we read into any of it, really, isn't it?
The other one you've got to think about is Samuel, who when Saul broke his own laws. Now, do we know any leaders who break their own laws?
All the time.
And he went to consult a medium. Samuel said, why have you disturbed me and brought me up here? Right? Samuel gives the impression, and that's all it can be, that he was asleep. But I think the important thing I want to say here to answer Wendy's question is when we die, the word death means separation. Physical life started when God made a body and breathed into it the spirit of life. Death occurs when the spirit of life leaves that body. It separates. Spiritual life is when we are in fellowship with God. Spiritual death is when we are separated from God. There is a parallel. That word death means separation. And so when we die, our body and our spirit is separated. And what we know about Jesus is he went to a place where he could communicate with those who had died, the spirits of those who died during the flood. So his body remained in the tomb and his spirit was in this place where they were kept. And that is the picture I have of Jonah. His body was in the tomb, but it was in the fish, but his spirit, in other words, he stopped breathing in the fish. While he was in the fish, he wasn't breathing. God took his spirit and put it somewhere else, in a place called Sheol.
He was also had the weeds wrapped around him, which would not have been in the belly of the fish. So the whole thing has an air of allegory about it.
Yeah,
It's not a straightforward, he fell over, was swallowed by a fish. And as
No.
you say, nobody could survive in the belly of a whale
No.
or a live fish because of the nature of
No.
the digestive juices. But
Yeah.
we've also, that thing in 1 Peter makes much more sense if that's the fallen angels. We've been through this before. I know you don't agree.
me and
with
you
it.
have, Philip, and I don't think it does because of the other verses where it talks about those who died in the flood. So we'll go there at some other time.
It doesn't say those who died in the flood. It says those who were disobedient in the time of the flood.
Right.
Something else, that is.
Okay.
Well, I'm
So
glad
go
Thank
on. Yeah. Who's
I
that?
just, yeah, okay.
Go on, Wendy.
I'm
Well,
just saying I'm glad I asked. 'Cause I
thank you.
understand now.
That's why we have sessions where people can ask, because I need to know I'm not confusing you, but I'm communicating.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to come in? Yes, Magdalene, let me.
69, which is quite helpful. It says, therefore my heart is glad and my glory rejoices. My flesh also will rest in hope, for you will not leave my soul in Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption.
Yeah.
It's the
So
two
we
places.
missed the start of that reference. Can you just tell us where that was from again, please?
Psalm 16, verse 9.
Psalm 16, verse 9. Jesus said he wouldn't, well, the psalmist said God would not leave his spirit as in Sheol, his life in Sheol. He would bring him back. Thank you. Anything else? If not, we're going to move on.
Yeah, can you, Nick wants to
Hi.
say something?
Yes, Nick.
Just a thought that not struck me before, just an observation which may or may not be right. Seeing that you pointed out it's such an important event that Jesus uses, I mean, there is this sense that Jonah sort of asked the sailors to throw him into the sea, and sort of almost like an act of some kind of act of sacrifice, and he was providing some kind of redemption for the people on the ship.
Yeah.
I mean, we know Jonah was probably trying to get away from God as much as he could, so that he was probably not really thinking about that. But it appears that, would it be right that somehow God has used this as some kind of prophetic foreshadowing of Jesus, what we've just been looking at?
I think we must assume that because Jesus twice referred to it and Paul referred to it. So 3 times we have testimony in the New Testament that this is something, unless somebody else can find, it would be reduced to 1. Jesus plainly referred to Jonah as the sign to them. Then after his resurrection, he talked about the scriptures saying he would rise on the 3rd day. And Paul said the same thing, that the scriptures said he would rise on the 3rd day. I do not know, and none of the commentators I've looked at have come up with anything where it actually talks in the Old Testament about the 3rd day. So we have to assume that this is a prophetic sign. Even though Jonah was running away in disobedience, God used it as a prophetic sign of what would happen to Jesus.
Can I just add that he did 2 separate signs, didn't he? He also talking about the men of Nineveh repenting, whereas his current audience weren't.
Yeah,
He
correct.
was,
Yeah.
He was doing midrash, as it were.
Yeah.